Right. Well, I say we get started, but if anybody comes in late, hopefully shouldn't be too intrusive. My name is Catherine Fletcher, for those who don't know me yet. I'm the coordinator of Cybersecurity Oxford, which is the network for all of the researchers anywhere in the University of Oxford who are interested in cybersecurity, which is defined as broadly as you like. If you need to get a hold of us for any reason, inquiries at cybersecurity.ox.ac.uk is the best way to find us, or just Google Cybersecurity Oxford, you'll find us. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Julian Merrick from IBM. He's a managing partner and vice president for IBM Security's worldwide security strategy, risk and compliance practice. Julian works with clients to develop security strategies suited to their specific needs, and has a particular focus on being able to talk to at the board level, although he understands the technical stuff, and especially helping understand the potential business impact of cybersecurity breaches or policies or insurance or any of that stuff. And I'm really hoping he might talk about the really cool battle bus that he's helped set up as part of the talk. I can go on about this, but I think you might hear a little bit more from him as he's going on about his experience, but he's got a CV as long as your arm and is terrifyingly qualified to have this conversation. In terms of ground rules for the meeting, I'm going to put myself on mute. You're welcome to leave your cameras on if you like, but poor Julian, once he starts the presentation and his slides are up, he won't be able to see you anyway, so it's as you wish, really. There's a chat function if you're not used to Teams. If you mouse over, there's a little bar that has the picture of the video camera and the microphone. There's a raise hand button, which does that, and there is a comment section, and you're welcome to add comments here. So that way, in the course of the conversation, if you just have a question that pops up, we might save it till later, but if it's important clarification, I'll see it and break in to sort of raise it to go back over anything. But otherwise, I think I will leave it. Oh, and I should say, you can see, I think, in the bottom of the screen, this is being recorded. So it's up to you what you want to put on record, but nothing is going to be streamed straight to YouTube. If anything happens that you don't want on record later, talk to us, we'll sort it out, don't worry. Thank you so much for coming, and I guess I'll turn over to our speaker.
Oh, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you, everybody. And I am very keen to make this a discussion, so very keen to have whatever questions people want to ask. So let me just get the slides going. It took a little bit of time to get up and running when we did this earlier, so hopefully it will happen. Okay. So hopefully you can see the slides now. So thank you very much for inviting me. And really what I want to talk about is assessing cyber risk as part of mergers and acquisitions. Now, might seem like quite an obscure area, but in reality, I think this is a very important topic, because the reality is that organizations do many more acquisitions than perhaps we are familiar with from reading the newspapers or whatever. And as we've been working with clients across the world, and we've had many clients who've told us that they're doing tens of acquisitions a year, and even one client who told me that they were doing 100 acquisitions a year, which I have to say I was quite surprised by. But the key thing is that the risks associated with mergers and acquisitions are increasing. And the expectation is, in the current environment, in the post-pandemic world, that there will be companies emerging from the pandemic who've done well and have cash. And obviously there will be organizations who have struggled, unfortunately, through the pandemic. So that there is an expectation that there will be more merger and acquisition activity in the next sort of year or so. This is kind of reinforcing some of the points that I've made, but let's just talk briefly about what these risks might be. So, unfortunately, when you acquire an organization, you have no idea what they have got in their networks. You can take measures, which we will talk about, in order to address that. But unfortunately, when you connect your network to this new organization, bad things can flow down the network. And what I would also say is it may not be the data in that to be acquired organization that is the problem, as we have seen, particularly over the last few months with some of the very visible cyber incidents and crises that have occurred. There are advanced persistent threats out there who are interested in positioning themselves inside one organization in order to get inside another organization. So it's entirely possible that a attacker might position themselves in a in an acquisition in order to get into the mothership, so to speak. And certainly organizations that are preparing themselves for to be acquired may well have slimmed themselves down a bit, may well have cut back in various areas, and security may well have been one of those areas, which will have made them easier for people to hack into and get ready to then come into the main organization. So I think that kind of explains why this is something that we think is going to become more of an issue. Now, unfortunately, the IT security team, the Chief Information Security Officers, learn about acquisitions very late in the deal lifecycle. I've talked to many customers about this. One CISO in an oil and gas company told me he only finds out about acquisitions when they're announced publicly. Another CISO in the transportation industry told me that he'd had two specific situations where they'd had breaches within weeks of an acquisition coming on board. And obviously, from his perspective, that created a real headache, because he's got scarce resources, individuals who are very busy, and he's got to divert those resources and those individuals to deal with these two breaches at short notice. And also, I think it's worth understanding that if we are talking about companies doing tens or as I say, even hundreds of acquisitions a year, then they are creating a very, very complex, infrastructure internally, which is going to have a lot of inherent challenges from a security perspective. And so the risk within the organization is really going to be building up quite significantly over time. And I think it's important that the organizations think about how are they going to manage risks in terms of that. And as I say, we think that, or we've seen evidence that attackers position themselves in the to be acquired organization. So how much media activity there is around an acquisition is going to increase the cybersecurity risk in that transaction. But the real question is that being considered up front? Is the mergers and acquisitions team even thinking about cybersecurity risk as part of the business case internally? So what I'm going to share with you is some data from a report that we have put together. So this was put together by our Institute for Business Value, who worked with Oxford Economics to survey 720 executives responsible for mergers and acquisitions functions at acquirer organizations across multiple industries, and really looking to understand how are they thinking about cybersecurity risk as part of their mergers and acquisitions process. So first of all, more than 1 in 3 executives say that their organization had experienced a breach that can be attributed to mergers and acquisition activity during integration. So as I say, I've had personal experience of people telling me about that, but the survey definitely supports that. And 1 in 5 had experienced breaches post-integration. So the data breaches really carry potential in terms of liabilities, in terms of lawsuits and non-compliance, and there are some pretty public examples that have been shared in the media of where quite significant costs have been created as a result of not considering cybersecurity as part of the potential liability, and people have had to deal with afterwards. So we then asked them, so when, if you do some form of cybersecurity assessment to investigate the cybersecurity risk, when are you actually doing this? And really interesting to see how few do this in terms of pre-acquisition. So only 5% have any form of security involvement in terms of the strategy and the screening parts of the process. Clearly, more gets involved as they go through to due diligence, but even 22% is not a lot. A lot then looking at it as part of their transaction, it's execution here, but still, as you can see to the right, a few who are doing this only once they've done the acquisition as part of the integration, or even a few who are admitting to never actually having considered this as part of the conversation. And 22% of them were saying that this lack of focus on cybersecurity has actually stopped a number of their mergers and acquisitions taking place. And that's quite worrying, because this is a core business initiative for the organization. This is something that the senior leadership have invested a lot of time and energy in it. And therefore, what you don't want to be doing is getting halfway down the track and then realizing that for cybersecurity risk reasons, you're going to pull out of it. That's not going to be good for anybody. So companies are spending about 7% of their total annual revenue on the mergers and acquisitions process. So they're spending a lot of money on this. So then if you are going to spend, how do you spend that money across that phase? So 15% of that money is being spent in the pre-acquisition phase, 64% of it is being spent in the acquisition phase, and then 21% is post-acquisition. So you definitely want to make sure that you're understanding the risks that cybersecurity is posing early on in that process, so that you're not spending all of this money and then pulling out on it. 35% of the executives said that one of the top 3 reasons they decided not to proceed was cybersecurity risk to be too great. So that's good to see. But what I'm going to talk about as well is how do you actually think about that cybersecurity risk? Actually, how do you come to that conclusion? Because as we know, many organizations use high, medium, low, red, amber, green, etc. as a way of assessing cyber risk. But I'm going to come to that in a second. So what do we think are the proactive measures that can be put in place to address this, to really reduce cybersecurity risk throughout the mergers and acquisitions life cycle? So not surprisingly, I want to talk about these 3 phases. So first of all, pre-acquisition. The key thing here is to actually make sure that there are IT security professionals, cybersecurity teams actually part of the pre-acquisition team, that they are actually building it into the business case. And this is actually having an ability to include cybersecurity risk in the overall business case. Because I think fundamentally what we should be doing is ending up with a situation where the cybersecurity risk is being built into the price that is being offered for the acquisition. And clearly, if nobody from IT security is involved in the pre-acquisition phase, then that's just not going to happen. There are ways of doing early stages assessments of the resilience of a target. We would sort of call this open source intelligence, but there are also third-party organizations out there that do scans, which are being used for supply chain risk assessment, for instance, and they could also be used to do some level of initial evaluation of what level of cybersecurity risk is that target list of whatever it is, the 10, 15 potential candidates that are being considered. some of them pretty quickly look like they're not organizations that should be on the list because they haven't been taking cybersecurity seriously. They've had security breaches. They've got data that is scattered all over the dark web, and it's pretty evident from the external visibility that this is not a good investment to make. So we would really suggest that it's important to begin assessing the cybersecurity risk, the regulatory risk, the compliance of these potential target lists as part of the pre-acquisition phase. So then in the acquisition phase, definitely need to get involved in due diligence, doing cybersecurity assessments, and potentially also looking at their supply chain in terms of third party, and really understanding what does that picture look like in that organization. And then we want to translate the findings from that due diligence into a monetary value for pricing and, as I say, for the negotiation, for consideration in the negotiation. Need to make sure we monitor media coverage in order to understand the level of visibility that this is getting in the media, because that will then create interest in hackers who might want to take that opportunity. But obviously, there may well be situations where there are threats already embedded in the organization to be acquired. So it's important to do a detailed penetration testing and evaluation of the organization as part of the due diligence, and really do a detailed cost of acquisition evaluation from a cybersecurity risk perspective. And then we get to the post-acquisition integration. So, clearly, if you understand the risks that are associated, then you may want to put in place a plan as to what are the steps that need to be taken to bring the acquisition up to the standards of security in the acquiring organization. But I would also argue it's important to think about the speed with which you actually want to do that integration. And this is where I think there's an opportunity for us to use what we're talking about a lot now in cybersecurity, which is zero trust, as a way of holding the acquisition at arm's length and really carefully managing that integration so that you're very clear as to what the level of risk is that you're bringing in. And again, if we're talking about doing this across tens of organizations, then I think you would want to evaluate very carefully over time. The more you get to know the acquisition, you can decide how close you want to bring them on board. Now, clearly, there are lots of business reasons as well in this, in terms of HR, marketing, and other subjects that would determine how quickly you want to bring an organization, within the organization fully. But certainly, our experience at IBM is we quite often label an acquisition as an IBM company, and we hold them at arm's length for sometimes 2 or 3 years before we actually bring them into the whole IBM organization. And I think from a security perspective, that has a lot of value. So I would also argue, as I said earlier, if you got examples of where that cybersecurity incidents have happened within weeks of these breaches, I think the CISO should be given some budget out of that acquisition to deal with that post-acquisition integration. So actually build in some money that can be used to do those integration activities, but also to fund any incident response activities that need to be dealt with. So I hope that's given you a kind of an understanding of why we think this is important as a risk area, and some thoughts in terms of what we think some of these specific areas are. Let me pause now and ask if there are any questions, and then I can go on to talk a little bit about actually how we do quantify the risk in financial terms, and how we then are able to build this into the business case. But any questions at this stage?
Well, I've got one, but I'll happily wait for anybody else to jump in. Oh, Andrew, yes.
Hi, yes, thank you. That's very interesting. I'm looking forward to the next bit. But it put me very much in mind of hearing some years ago now, that of mergers and acquisitions failing due to mundane issues of IT integration, and that, I guess, now making it onto the roadmap as a significant thing in planning a pre-acquisition. So I wondered, do you think that in this sense cybersecurity is just a few years behind IT integration, or are the issues so different that you have to think of it differently?
Well, I would say yes and no. I mean, certainly at one level, obviously, if if you're going to make decisions about, for instance, using a zero trust approach, holding them at arm's length, that is fundamentally going to drive your IT strategy. I think many organizations have really struggled with IT integrations, and as everybody moves further on the digital transformation journey, that integration of IT is going to become a more and more fundamental topic. So security, I think, is definitely part of that IT integration, but I think it is, frankly, bigger than that as well, because the reality is it's not just about IT, it's about things like your supply chain, for instance, and what are the implications of this, and what are the implications from a business perspective, because there are examples of where cybersecurity breaches have really held back organizations quite significantly. So at a business level, the risk of bringing in an acquisition, being infected as a result of that with ransomware or whatever, and that really impacting the core business way beyond the business case for the acquisition, I think is a risk that needs to be considered. And so that's probably a much more of a business level conversation than just about an IT integration conversation.
Great, thank you.
I have a very quick clarification follow on. You've kind of answered it already, but on your slide you said 22% of executives say that lack of focus on cybersec somehow derailed an acquisition. I can tell myself stories about what I can imagine might have happened, but do you know what the kind of scenarios would be that would actually, at what point was it derailed, and what kinds of things were happening to knock it off course?
Well, I think a lot of the ones that have been identified so far have been more, frankly, compliance rather than what I would regard as cybersecurity, because that's going to be easier for people to spot, unfortunately. So the reality is that they have identified that the organization that they're hoping to acquire is not doing privacy seriously, is not doing compliance properly, and therefore is not something that they want to invest in. That doesn't mean that they've gone down to the technical level and actually gone in to look at what malware is buried in the acquisition, what threat actors are already present in there, and understood those risks. So I think it is a case of looking at this at multiple layers, and as I tried to show here, this is a journey. It's important that security is involved at the beginning, but it's definitely going to be a case of looking at it more and more deeply over the period of the acquisition process. And I think it's really important that conversation happens as part of the negotiation, and that the assessment of how good you think the organization is from a cybersecurity risk perspective, is used as part of the business case, and that the selling organization or the acquiring organization has built this into their openness and their price, so to speak. That also prompts me to point out, I've talked a lot about mergers and acquisitions here. This is just as true for divestments as well. So if you want to do a divestment, you need to make sure that you are able to demonstrate to the organization that you're going to be selling the divestment to that you've taken cybersecurity seriously, and that the organization is, clean, so to speak, that you are divesting.
Oh, thank you. It's really helpful. So 2 more hands have popped up. The first was Ian Townsend, and then Dennis. Are you happy to take some more questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Ian, take it away.
Yeah, hi, Julian. Thank you very much. Really interesting. I suppose one of the things that springs to mind is we're talking here a lot about inherent risks, I suppose, in the business. Do you see that there are also risks as a result of that transition? So, whilst that business is running and in operation, they've got the risks that they carry there. But the process of transitioning them to a new business, that creates risks in itself. In your experience, are they treated separately? Do they get, do they come under the same umbrella?
Well, no, yeah. So I think, are you talking about what we would call the transition phase as part of bringing them in? So before you get to the sort of business as usual run phase, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, I guess
yeah.
So. I'm sort of thinking a business that you might acquire might not have any risks as it's running at the moment, but once you acquire them, by leaving their previous mothership, it causes risks, or the supply chain changes, or their risks that aren't necessarily present at that point that you assess them, but they become a risk.
No, well, absolutely. I think, I mean, this is a conversation that we have pretty regularly across Europe. In my experience, we probably have more businesses in Europe that are very famous for having what they would describe as a decentralized approach. They think that's important to their culture. They think that's important to their ability to innovate, etc. And they, many of them have a long history of being very successful from that perspective. But I would argue that it's difficult to do in a decentralized way. So yes. What you need to do is, as that organization comes on board, as I say, you may want to kind of hold them at some level of arm's length from an integration perspective, but you definitely want to then work with them on getting them up to the level of security standards that are, regarded as acceptable in the main organization, and that is something that you want to invest in doing pretty rapidly, because if they are not part of the organization, then they, and they're just doing their own security, they can still have brand impact, they can still have, reputational impact, and they could well have, regulatory impact as well. So you're still going to end up being called in front of the regulator because they're part of your organization. So for all those reasons, that transition phase is very, very important. But it comes back to me for what I've been saying about the media as well. There's a risk in that transition phase that you're going to get a lot more interest from attackers during that transition phase. So you need to be really aware of it. And that's why I think it's important that IT security don't just get told about this the day it gets announced publicly. If you're doing that, you're creating a potential nightmare effectively of what could happen to the organization.
Thank you.
I've got a question from Dennis still, and I've got a question also from Angeliki in the comments. So Dennis, if you happen to know that yours is related to hers, you can bundle them together. Otherwise, go for it.
Thank you. Hi, Julian. Thank you very much for your great talk. I'm quite interested in the topic. And there is one area that I'm particularly keen to learn more about. You mentioned the necessity to price in risk into the whole valuation and negotiation process. And so I'm relatively well aware of how that pricing process works in a typical M&A transaction, with initial price points being estimated via relative and intrinsic valuations. But what I really wonder about, or have been wondering for some time, is how one would actually price cybersecurity risks into this process. So are you aware of any metrics or any best practices as to how one would price in this risk in that initial estimation process?
That's the section I'm going to come to next. So that's a fantastic lead in. So Catherine, shall I go to the next section, so to speak, and then we can come back and do some more questions after that?
That sounds perfect. If it's okay, Angeliki, I'll keep your question. We'll come back to it, but we'll just keep going with the thing for now in case that also gets answered on the way through. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angeliki. So the three key takeaways I've really shared with you is, security should be part of the mergers and acquisitions team. We need to execute these assessments early, and it needs to be built in. And then finally, we need to quantify cybersecurity exposure. So let me explain how we do this quantification of cybersecurity exposure. So one of the key factors for me here is risk is unfortunately one of those words in English which means different things to different people. And in our experience, many organizations have unfortunately got lists of top risks that we would argue are not really risks. And the classic one of those is, example of those for me is cloud, where people say, oh, well, moving to the cloud is a risk. And I would say, well, actually, you don't understand the risks that you're currently running often. And moving to the cloud is actually going to address a number of cybersecurity risks that organizations are living with today, perhaps not understanding them. So it's really about looking at the two risk pictures. But the way we determine risk is by building what we call a risk scenario. And a risk scenario for us consists of these three factors. So it needs to be a threat, and obviously that could be internal or could be external, to an asset that has business value, and that threat actually has an effect on that business asset. So it's a threat having a business impact on an asset. And so that allows us to start to define within organizations, what do we really mean by a risk scenario? So there's value literally just to beginning to use this terminology in many organizations. But what we're then able to do is using a model called the FAIR model, which is an open standard model, we're actually able to calculate what that loss is in financial terms. And we do that by looking at it in two ways. So first of all, we want to calculate what we call the loss frequency. Well, it's looking at this for an annual loss exposure. And what we're looking to do here is calculate it in terms of what we call the threat event frequency. So the likelihood of that threat being successful, and the resistance strength within the organization. So that's where we look at the controls. That's where we look at the confidence that we have in the cybersecurity processes and controls that are in place. And so from that, we use calibrated estimation to come up with a annualized loss frequency. And then on the right-hand side, we look at the loss magnitude. And so again, we look at this in terms of two factors. We look at it in terms of primary loss. And so the primary loss is what are going to be the internal costs of this risk happening. So what are the additional resources that you'd have to put in to deal with this crisis, this situation? What are the losses of productivity internally or whatever that are going to occur, and other internal costs? And then we also look at what we call the secondary losses. And so the secondary losses are what are the external impact that this incident could happen, could create. So regulatory fines, but also reputational damage, market share loss, those kind of values. And so what we're then able to do is quantify that in financial terms, and then we apply the annual loss frequency to the loss magnitude, and that gives us an ability to quantify the risk in financial terms. Now we can use Monte Carlo simulations to actually look at that in terms of a most likely and least likely and a worst case. So there's some variability in here, but that at least gives you an ability to really calculate what is the financial risk associated. And this for me is a big step forwards, because too many organizations have been trying to assess risk in terms of high, medium, low, red, amber, green, CMMI 1 to 5, which is extremely subjective, but it also often doesn't involve the conversation between the business and IT security about the value of the data, the process, the business asset. And we've dealt with breaches, unfortunately, a number of breaches, where it's become apparent that nobody in the business explains to the IT security organization the value of certain data sets, and that they were likely to be, a risk. They were likely to be of value to attackers, and therefore they haven't been treated any differently. And so it's really, really important that this conversation takes place to actually put a business value on things. And clearly, as part of mergers and acquisitions, you can then start to use this to build it into the price negotiation, as I referred to earlier.
Can I jump in with a quick clarification question?
Yep.
This FAIR model, is this some proprietary IBM thing that we have to ask you to do, or is it open source? Can we look at a copy of how you do it?
So it's open source. It comes from an organization called the FAIR Institute. I will say IBM is now a sponsor of the FAIR Institute, and I'm now on their industry advisory board. But one of the reasons that we have chosen to partner with the FAIR Institute is because it is a open standard. It's open to anybody, and I would say it's even so open that there's a book that hopefully, I don't know if you can see this, but I can show it to you later, which is called Measuring and Managing Information Risk, which actually goes through this in a lot of detail. So you don't have to do more than buy the book, and you can start to use this model.
Oh, thank you.
So that was really what I wanted to cover. There's a few more slides if you want to have a look at the deck later that talks about ourselves and Oxford Economics and the approach to the survey content that I talked to. But I hope this has been useful in terms of explaining our approach, what we're seeing, and I'm very happy to take any more questions.
Thank you. If it's okay, I'll pull out Angeliki's question, and if you want to jump in yourself on audio, please do. But she asks, are specific risks related to the process of acquisition that are different compared to the ones that arise when companies collaborate with other organizations?
I would argue that they are extremely similar in reality. So absolutely, I mean, supply chain risk, as been very public in recent months, is also a key area that organizations need to pay more attention to, and it's interesting that it's catching out organizations a lot, because people have perhaps in the past looked at supply chain risk in terms of the suppliers to them, not on the business criticality of that supplier. And one of our clients was telling us recently about a situation where very small supplier, not contributing a huge amount, or not charging a huge amount financially for what they provided to the organization, but it was absolutely fundamental to a lot of their products. And this particular organization was relatively small, was subjected to a ransomware attack and went down. And immediately that caused a disruption in the supply chain out of all proportion to the size of the organization. And I think that's something that organizations now need to really think about much more seriously. So I would argue the same for an acquisition. A relatively small acquisition coming in with no cybersecurity, on board today, with a horrendous amount of malware, bringing that into the organization could cause a vast impact on the acquirer, way beyond the amount of money they spent on the acquisition.
Thank you very much.
Dennis, I see your hand is still up. You got a follow-up question? Oh, no. Has anybody else got any questions for our speaker? I think it was a nice, lovely, clear presentation. So you've answered a lot of the questions I thought I was going to ask as you were going along.
Whoops, sorry, if I may, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Apologies for that. Sorry, Julian, thanks for the explanations. I've just one question, and I'm sorry to take the role of the advocatus diabolus here a bit. So I did try to educate M&A professionals in the past on potential cybersecurity risks arising from such fundamental transactions. But the problem that I've experienced when I talk to M&A professionals about that topic is that the acquisition price is essentially a function of discounted future cash flows. And many professionals argue that the potential impact of a security breach in the future, discounted to today, is, well, it's not only subjective, but they also claim that it's by no means large enough to justify spending any money on experts doing any sort of cybersecurity due diligence, simply because when we discount any sort of sum of money to the present, it basically becomes, very, very small. What would you say to professionals taking that sort of perspective? How would you justify spending money on that sort of due diligence, as they would claim those really large incidences that are really, really costly? A, don't happen very often, and B, they are probably way in the future, so that we don't care about it when we assess the price point today.
Well, so I would give them the evidence of as I said earlier, we know of organizations who have had to divert money at very short notice to deal with breaches as a result of acquisitions. That's money that's not been built into people's budget, and it's money that has to be got hold of at a very short notice. So it's all very well for them to say, it's subjective, but it's not when you do a risk calculation using the FAIR methodology. I think it really starts to surface the fact that this is business risk that the organization is going to be running. And, the question becomes, what is the business value that the organization is seeking to get out of this acquisition, but also what is the risk that is associated with it? And I believe that there are some examples, and I don't want to pick on particular situations, too publicly, so to speak. But I think the Marriott Starwood Hotels one is one that's had quite a lot of publicity, and is a very good example that I would argue where whatever calculations were made up front were somewhat disrupted in terms of the financial case by the size of the issue that occurred when the breach occurred. So that the fines that have to be paid as a result can definitely alter the value of the acquisition. Now, as I said at the beginning, we need to think about this not just for organizations that are doing large ones like Starwood, but also for organizations that are doing a lot of small acquisitions, where it may be that you don't want to build it into the business case for each acquisition, but I would argue that you need to include security in the process, and there needs to be a way of evaluating the risk and then putting a budget to say we are going to potentially need some money, over these 10 acquisitions. We're going to need potentially this amount of money, and therefore we need to put it aside as part of the business case over the 10 acquisitions rather than on a single one or whatever. So I think there are different ways of dealing with this, but I would certainly say saying this is not relevant in today's environment is exposing an organization to a risk, which I think as business leaders they need to evaluate, and that using a financial approach rather than high, medium, low is going to be much more successful in having that conversation.
Brilliant. That's really helpful, Julian. Thanks very much.
Any other questions from anybody?
So I would say that this has been really helpful in terms of principles, and it might be that if I look into the FAIR model, that might get me a long way towards it. But if you were looking at, I mean, just if you had an organization with an ICT person who maybe had never done a merger before or just had never really been systematic, where would you point them for the best advice, like checklist or things to watch for or whatever?
Well, so we have published a white paper which includes the findings from the survey, and it's got an action plan in it, which was part of, I shared part of that in that slide where I talked about pre-acquisition and during the due diligence process and then post-acquisition. So I would say have a look at that. But most importantly for me, it's about proactively as a CISO or person responsible for IT security risk within the organization, proactively going and having a conversation with the mergers and acquisitions team. And I think that's fundamentally the problem in many organizations today, which is that conversation is not taking place because the M&A team are not thinking about it. So they're not reaching out to IT security. IT security is not being, having the visibility, and they, for whatever reason, haven't seen it as something that they need to get involved in. But certainly we've got clients who have, even one client who has a dedicated member of their IT security team who is part of or assigned to be part of their mergers and acquisitions team because they do multiple acquisitions a year. And I think that's absolutely, important to take that approach.
Thank you. If I just was trying to do a quick Google search on the side to see if I could find the white paper. What should I be looking under? Because I was going to put a link in the chat to be all sneaky, but I wasn't fast enough.
No, that's right. I can send a link to the paper to you and David, and you can share that afterwards together with the slides. I'm very happy for you to do that, and I'm also very happy to do a session on risk quantification using the FAIR model if people would be interested. Very happy to do a session on that as well, because I think that is something that's going to become a hotter and hotter topic. The FAIR Institute's now got 11,000 members worldwide. It's got chapters all around the world. There's a chapter in London. So I think this is something that's going to become a much more common topic, shall we say, going forwards.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. I'd love to follow up with you about that. Now, if anybody who's here on this call either would be interested or knows somebody who would be, let me know. But there's no rush, just sort of, it'd be nice to pursue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If anybody has any last minute questions, don't be shy. This is your moment. Otherwise, I think we'll thank our speaker because you've been a hero. It's really hard to do these online.
Well, thank you for all the questions. It's also, for a speaker, it's much more enjoyable if you have questions and people engage in the discussion. So thank you very much. It's been fun.
Oh, brilliant. Well, we hope to get you back again sometime, and maybe in person, and we can actually see you properly.
That would be great.
Well, thank you. We'll see you around then, I guess.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for sharing your time, and I hope you found it useful.
Fabulous. I'll see you around. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.